Hello, teachers. Thank you for listening to my proposal. What I would like to suggest to you is a possible way to incorporate an art lesson into your figurative language unit in third grade ELA. So, by doing so, I am hoping that through the creation and the production of a work of art, that your students are learning deeper, more meaningful content in specifically the unit on onomatopoeia. Your previous lesson is wonderful for students and can certainly have them read and discover some examples of figurative language, okay, in your book for snow. I think it's called Go Snow. But in this lesson, what I am suggesting is that students not only read that book, but also look for examples of onomatopoeia and figurative language elsewhere, and then apply that to create a work of art. By doing so, research suggests that students therefore will learn the content and be able to apply it again in a longer, different setting. Certainly, what you're doing in your lesson is perfectly reasonable and certainly gives them a way to remember and learn this material. But by integrating with art, students are now finding a practical approach to possibly seeing this elsewhere and retaining this information longer. So if you would for me, please, I'm going to go through some slides with you about how you can teach your content to your standards integrated with art, and then produce an example of an onomatopoeia figurative language art project created from another teacher, and finally where you can assess and gather all this information into Schoology. So if you would for me, please let me go through some of the things that you could do in your own classroom to integrate art into your figurative language unit. So teachers, as I mentioned, the lesson that we are hoping to revamp with art integration is your figurative language lesson. This project should replace what is your lesson on day 4 on onomatopoeia. After you're reading this book, Splotch and Gotcha, with your students, I am suggesting that we replace this unit with a lesson that more focuses on art integration, using onomatopoeia and a pop art. So the neat thing about this unit is that it's going to still be able to accomplish with you a similar result and standards, but by incorporating art, the hope is that students will retain this information longer and be able to use this and apply it in other settings. And perhaps you find that this may be, at the end, more successful than what you have done previously. So, how are we using onomatopoeia in our art integration lesson? First, we have to review with students what an onomatopoeia is. We're talking to them about a word that's formed and spelled similar to how it sounds. And we can find evidence of this in English. Okay, certainly we're getting students to brainstorm in a little bit about what they are using to create their own onomatopoeia artwork here. This is still going to incorporate your ELA standard in the Common Core for determining means of words and phrases like figurative language in grade level text, but it's also going to incorporate a national standard for art education in determining messages communicated by an image. So they're looking at an example of an onomatopoeia and deciding how they're going to create that work of art to represent, of course, a word that's spelled like how it sounds. So our objective here is to enhance this identity of examples in onomatopoeia through text in creating an art-based work on figurative language. And finally, we'll assess this by finding students. We're going to be looking at formative assessment on finding examples in text, creating work of art, and reflecting in our online on Schoology. So how would I propose introducing this to students is that we need to look for examples. Our artists are, after all, visual learners, but now we're also applying this to reading. So I like to begin with students is where can we find some examples of this? And how do we use figurative language, specifically onomatopoeia, in our own, like in school, in our real situation? So I would introduce to students the book Gotcha, which you already use, as well as ask them to find examples in their own class library. Certainly with students, they may have copies of graphic novels such as Dogman and Cat Kid in their desk, and this is a way that they are easily identifying onomatopoeia within their choice. So it is perfectly acceptable to give students a book like Gotcha, but it's also interesting to have students see if they can find examples of these visuals from things that they chose, graphic novels and books that they choose to read. After you're identifying some examples in books, I would move on to beginning to observe artists. Okay, we're going to integrate this in art now that also use onomatopoeia in their work of art. An example is the artist Roy Lichtenstein. You can take students to the website about Roy Lichtenstein's work on Encyclopedia Britannica and have students browse and find examples of his own work that utilizes onomatopoeia, excuse me. In Roy Lichtenstein's artwork, you can find examples of these words that are spelled like how it sounds to create a style of art called pop art. There's a video segment that walks through how the artist used some of his ideas as well and was inspired to use the primary colors in art as a symbolism of the modern age. And students can be excited by his work because they find things relatable to what they see in their own everyday screen time and life as well. So step one, find examples in our class library. Step two, we're going to observe an artist. And finally, we're going to get a chance to brainstorm as a class. So I would ask now that students have an opportunity to create something called a web map. They've done these before on onomatopoeia. You could have students do an I do, you do, we do, where you're asking them to generate in their table groups some suggestions of words that might be onomatopoeia, and then share out loud using our new line projectors to create a class web map. Or you could have them do this individually. It's entirely up to you. You have to decide on your own classroom dynamic. But basically, once they've made a choice, you're going to pick one example of that onomatopoeia that we've brainstormed after looking at our artist, and we're going to use that word to create a work of art. This is the stage where we are going to begin the art integration portion. So at this point, students are now going to go through a tutorial on how to create an artwork based on onomatopoeia. To continue, now we're in the point where we are going to integrate in an art lesson to our onomatopoeia figurative language unit. And I always say a good artist doesn't borrow, a good artist steals. And there is a really great tutorial from an artist by the name of Sarah Kotweski, who was art teacher of the year in Wisconsin. And she walks through a really neat YouTube tutorial on how to of language in a drawing. Essentially, what she does is she is not using an example of an onomatopoeia. She is using the word create here. But she still goes through and spells through the steps on how to create a 3D looking letter, as well as add lines for emphasis, and finally coloring inspired by the onomatopoeia art of Roy Lichtenstein and also comic book artwork that we have seen with the Cat Kid books and the Gotcha book and the Dogman novels that our students going to identify. By working through her steps, students are going to use the concepts that she teaches to create 3D letters, colorize them, and finally cut out her example of an onomatopoeia, or in this case, she calls it a superhero word. But this art teacher on YouTube has very clear instructions and is very exciting and dynamic to have students observe and learn from. So I say find someone who does it and see if you can have students do it even better. So I would recommend showing this video that is linked in my slides here for how to create your very own onomatopoeia pop art. And then finally, we are ready to assess our students. So they looked for examples of onomatopoeia and figurative language. They looked at the artwork of Roy Lichtenstein. They then did a brainstorming map of how to come up with some examples of onomatopoeia themselves. And finally, they created a work of art. So we want our students to decide what is the big takeaway, like what did they learn from this lesson? And the way that I would do that is I would have students upload this content to Schoology. This is a folder that I have already shared with you to your classrooms that has all the examples of everything that was just in my slides, including the automata demonstration, from the superhero art word with Sarah Krasnowski on the Cool Beans Art Club, artist examples from Roy Lichtenstein, the slides that I showed in this PowerPoint here, as well as a final demonstration from me. It's the video to a Google link from a project I did last year. And lastly, there's a figurative language assessment on onomatopoeia. If you click this link, it'll take students through asking them some assessment questions based on where they find their onomatopoeia, what did they choose, can they define it, and finally an uploading of their artwork. This is a way that you can collect then information, teachers, to see if your students learned content from their piece. So in conclusion, I am suggesting through art integration into your figurative language unit in class that students are now using a artwork to create their own style onomatopoeia and use as a replacement to learn in your unit. Finally, they'll upload their imagery and describe what they created as a form of assessment to give a conclusion and a final grade for students on this lesson. In a 90-minute ELA, I believe that just should take about a half an hour to brainstorm and generate ideas, about another half an hour to create their work of art, and finally about 20 minutes, 15 minutes to get that uploaded to Schoology and complete a final assessment. So teachers, with your approval, I would really encourage you to consider incorporating an art integration of a pop art onomatopoeia into your figurative language lesson for this school year.